Hello, it's Saturday, March the 26th, and Mars is in Cancer, and we're heading towards a conjunction between Mercury and Jupiter and Aries. Of course, Aries is ruled by Mars, so the meaning of this Mercury and Jupiter conjunction in Aries is colored by the ruler Mars being in Cancer, where it's in its fall in the first degree of, the beginning of Cancer there. Now, I've got a number of ideas of things which are relevant to talk about to these topics, and where can I start? Let's say I did watch Adam Elenbaas's video on Mars and Cancer yesterday, and I have to admit that one of my approaches to doing these astrology videos is that if there's any astrologer that I actually follow, it's Adam Elenbaas, because he's the guy I trained with, and I just like his approach to doing astrology. However, he is a guy who's in a very different life circumstance and a very different life situation, and I don't always relate to that, being in that position in life, and I've had different kind of things. Like, I have this whole thing too where I don't want to put all my personal life in my videos. However, but there's certain things that I might as well just go into some of it in this one, because there's something about Cancer and what that stands for with family stuff that, but the whole thing though is that if I have things to work out with my family, it always seems clear and obvious to me that that should be done in an appropriate context, and that if there's it's like I don't feel like it's appropriate, like if I have issues with people, to go on the internet and complain about them and then do something all public and say how or whatever, right? Like I'm not even suggesting that I even would have, that I think I'm on pretty good terms with my family, but whatever issue there may be, I don't feel like it's appropriate to use to be kind of like passive aggressive on social media behind people's. It's not the appropriate way to deal with things, right? So I don't want to spend too much time, getting into any problems that I may have with my family or not, right? However, there's also one of the things that because Cancer rules the family, or it has to do with family stuff. One of the things that I also noticed Adam Elenbaas talk about was that it also had to do with, like, he was talking about like neighborly disputes and things like that, and it was like there's this thing that goes on where we have a neighbor that we always have had difficulties with ever since he moved in, and the thing about it is that there's kind of the problem with when my family has difficulties that affect the family, is that there's this, especially with Mars and Cancer, I feel like it triggers this off, this thing about like bad blood, lots of anger and resentment and all this kind of stuff, and the whole I find it also ties in very well with Mercury and Jupiter, right? And I'm a guy, I'm not going to post my chart, well, I don't know, not this video anyways, but I've got a strong Jupiter and I've got a strong Mercury in its own way. So I think in some way I'm sympathetic to both a Mercury side of things as well as a Jupiter side of things. But overall, I'm more of a Jupiter kind of person. I've got stronger placements in Jupiter signs. And if you're a Jupiter, a child of Jupiter, a Jupiter kind of personality, there's a tendency to have an attitude where you don't sweat the small stuff. You know what I mean? Like, there's big picture problems that are very significant, and then there's things that are really like, especially, I'm thinking you're an astrologer and you're contemplating the movement of the cosmos and the Earth as a kind of a united whole and being in this kind of stellar motion. And then, so if somebody wants to nitpick about really small things, it's kind of like, get a life, man. You know what I mean? But the thing about this neighbor is that, like, I actually, like, last year, we received a complaint from the bylaw officer about blackberry bushes, and I admit that blackberries can be a huge problem. That they can grow, if you don't keep your blackberry bushes trimmed, they just go out of control. And so I took it upon myself, because I was recovering in 2021, I was in the hospital with a major health crisis, and I have been building back up my physical health. And I took it as a kind of a serendipity that rather than to look at it as with resentment that this is being imposed upon me, that we really need to clean up our blackberry bushes, I thought this would be a great way for me to get more exercise, for me to get more fresh air, for me to get, have some motivation to work in the garden. And I did a lot of blackberries last year. And it was kind of funny though, because like the actual guy who complains about it only had one tiny little blackberry encroaching onto his lawn. We had this other, all our other neighbors had tons, like the guy that complains had very little problem, whereas other neighbors are probably too nice to complain, but I feel sorry for them because I'm like, oh man, these guys really need the blackberries cleared out of their fence. The guys who aren't complaining need it more than the guy who's making a big fuss about it, right? Which kind of makes the guy making a fuss about it seem like an asshole if he barely has any issue to deal with, but he's the one complaining, whereas these other people just put up with it. I appreciate the people who put up with it, and I feel more kind towards them, and I want to help them out. But if the guy is an asshole, has to give me a kick in the ass, I guess that's what you have to do, right? But so last year I did tons of work on the blackberries, and then this year, but the thing is, one of the things that we did is went back a number of years ago. In 2010 I went traveling in Australia, and one of the things that I picked up in Australia was I met some people who are into permaculture. And when I came back to Canada, that was one of the things that I don't know. I ended up having a mental health crisis. I don't know if you know my whole story, but one of my ideas of like wanting to connect with people, I always thought that permaculture was something that was cool, that was something I resonated with, and that I don't have a lot of earth placements, but I like the idea of permaculture and the idea of approaching gardening from this different way that's it's a more holistic way to do gardening, right? And one of the permaculture perspectives is that when it comes to like leaves and stuff like this, that when falling leaves, I mean, there's often bylaws and stuff like that you can't have leaves, you have to pick up your leaves, but actually having just a manicured lawn with no leaves on it and stuff like that is a kind of like a kind of totally sterile zone that doesn't really foster life, whereas the dead leaves actually provide this thing where insects come and lay their eggs in the leaves, and that, maybe people might have some sort of attitude against insects as, oh, they're bugs and they're gross, but actually from an ecological point of view, it's actually very healthy to have certain insects, part of the ecosystem. It's part of the natural cycle of life to have leaves fall and decompose and go to the soil and provide kind of cover for things to lay their eggs, and that's our concept behind permaculture. Unfortunately, our neighbor likes a really manicured lawn, and funny thing is that we don't only have one oak tree. We have an oak tree in the front yard and an oak tree in the backyard. I had this kind of insight that it's almost like the lungs, right? Because if you look at the trees which breathe the air for us, and if you look at the branches of our lungs, they're almost like trees. And the fact that we have two of these big oak trees, they're almost like they're the two big lungs of the neighborhood, right? That are breathing almost, because we've got the biggest oak trees in the neighborhood in this house. It's actually pretty cool. But our neighbor just hates the leaves. And it was funny too, because I would talk a lot about this guy Byung, and even Byung, apparently he loves gardening, but Byung hates oak leaves. they're like the stuff that covers up everything. He's like, and so I'm kind of like, I took a position though anyways. I was also reading this idea that there's a certain style of gardening that they used to do at some point in time, where you would have one area being like dedicated to food production, which is like, we're going to plant things in rows and grow food and stuff we would harvest to eat. And another area, things that were like more in totally ornamented in like, or whatever. It would be like potted plants and nicely manicured things and very orderly and everything, like the way that these rich, people with their manicured lawns and everything perfect like it, and then there's another place where you just let things go wild, right? But there's an idea with these three gardens that it's not like choosing one of these ways to garden or one of these ways to handle agriculture or plants dominates over all the others, but rather that you could have a place in which each of these elements lives together in harmony, right? And to say that we don't have to be totalizing in the way that we look at things. Like, we don't have to be, everything has to be a totally manicured lawn with all the hedges trimmed into like completely unnatural man-made shapes or something. Or everything has to be completely wild, or everything has to be completely just industrial food production. It doesn't have to be one thing all the time, but you have these different elements which are always playing off each other, right? And I also, I'm thinking about this kind of German stuff about like there's something about my neighbor. Apparently he's a German guy. I don't know him very well, but my mom always refers to him as the German. And there's this kind of like underlying kind of, racial tension as us being the dirty Slavs and him being the clean German who wants to like take us to the eugenics officer or something like that and have us exterminated. It's kind of like got a bit of that vibe going on, right? And, maybe it's a bit extreme to push it in that direction, but there's something about all this. Like, the whole thing about making this video is like, it could be really easy for me to just call my neighbor a fascist and be all defensive about it. But what I wanted to say is that, like, I bought Martin Heidegger's Being in Time, and Heidegger, unfortunately Heidegger was actually a Nazi supporter. Right? So I don't know how on board, like, there's something about Heidegger that it's like this contradiction, though, that there's something that seems like he was onto something that was cool, and there is something about Heidegger being in tune with the land and being in tune, like you only experience the land if you're working on the land and being a part of the working, the man with his hammer. There's all this Heidegger stuff that is like Byung hand talks about it a lot, and I'm like, Heidegger's not so bad, right? But then he was a Nazi. He did end up just becoming a Nazi. So there's things like that but there's also this question of astrology and the aesthetification of politics and all this kind of stuff. And if you noticed for a while, I was doing these videos that were very philosophical, and part of my intention to do these philosophical videos was because I am a fully stacked Sagittarius, and I was having I've got not just Sagittarius, but Sag and Pisces, and my chart was being absolutely hammered by Mars and Gemini for that 8 months. And if there's any, like, I can kind of understand that some people might, like, see these Mars transits as an opportunity to give yourself a workout, right? Like, to go to the gym and pump some iron, right? And it's just, I kind of think, like, maybe it's just the way my chart is, my personality is that my version of pumping iron was like, I'll finish Deleuze and Felix Guattari's Anti-Oedipus. I'll finish Cosmos and Psyche. I'll start reading Dostoevsky. I'll start, I'm just like, I'm not ripped in terms of muscles, but I'm just gonna like lift books and grow my brain, right? Because that's kind of what I'm into these days. I'm also thinking about getting more exercise and trying to get strong, but I don't know. I'd rather stimulate myself intellectually. At least I've got a thirst for knowledge. What can I say? Anyways, all this stuff though. I was talking about ideas like anti-fascist astrology. I was talking about stuff like Wilhelm Reich and how Wilhelm Reich had this theory of like whatever. There's one of these books that I'm reading anyways is Wilhelm Reich's Mass Psychology of Fascism. Now, I have to admit though, I don't know if I agree with all of Wilhelm Reich's ideas, and but there's something about this which is very I also have to admit maybe it's questionable whether this video would even go over very well. But one of the things that I noticed is that Wilhelm Reich has his Mars placement at the 0 degree of Cancer, right? And so one of the things that has happened recently, and I also have to admit, I'm making this video, I might as well just go for it, right? there are certain things though when it comes to, let's say, the mystical experience that Adam Elenbaas talks about this, not putting it all online or something like that, because you can have things just to keep to yourself and whatnot, and that sometimes there's this thing that happens when you try to like go around and tell everybody about the cool synchronicities that you've had and the interest in it, then people, it just sort of like starts to, what seems really live and juicy starts to like, as soon as you start talking about it, you lose it. Or like you'll tell somebody and they're like, I don't get it, man. It doesn't sound or like what is really resonant and meaningful to you. You talk about it, and people they'll just be like, they don't get it, or they'll think you're crazy, or that it loses its potency by like maybe, or it becomes you do a good job. You're like, I'll express this as a Facebook post, and I will put my insight onto Facebook, and then people will like it and share it, and then but the thing is, there's something about that by doing that it starts to be like, oh, it's not. Now it's just this thing out on the internet, and now it's been kind of like neutralized because it's now just been incorporated, and people, it's something that I use to get people to like me. You know what I mean? It's not like some transcendent truth. It's like, let's put this out there and see how many friends I can get with it. Let's see how much money I can get with it. Let's see what it can do for me. And then you kind of forget what the insight was, and you just get hung up. Nobody likes my insights, and then you're like, you just missed the point, right? I'm kind of, well, what am I going with this? Where am I going with this? I've had some experience, there's this whole thing that came to mind, the topic of cloudbusting, right? And Kate Bush wrote a song called Cloudbusting, which was actually about Wilhelm Reich. It was when I was going through tough times, it was an important song for me. And a lot of Kate Bush's songs and lyrics help to sort of remind me that other people, I don't know what the hell Kate Bush is going through, but she's obviously going, Kate Bush is obviously on the level, right? Kate Bush is on the level, and there's certain, if you're into art and music and you go through your own stuff, you can, even if it's lonely, even if you go to times that are very isolating and very lonely and very difficult, you can still, through art and music, see that there are other people who know what it's about, that you're not completely misunderstood, even if those people aren't your friends, even if they're just people whose records you collect or something like this, right? But the whole thing, though, is that then there's a sign that it's not just you're not just some freaky weirdo who experiences weird stuff like cloud, but the skies, being all, heaven parts open and the sun comes beaming out with there's things. I was having some moments like that, and it got me thinking about cloud busting. And I made a post on the Shades of Awakening. Maybe some friends from that site, that group, maybe watching these videos. I talked about cloud busting a bit, and then it wasn't until after I'd read that post about cloud busting and thinking about Wilhelm Reich that I decided, what's this astrology chart? And then it was like, oh my god, Wilhelm Reich has Mars. It's like that ingress of Mars into Cancer, and like clockwork, it sets off my dumb neighbor, sorry neighbor, who nitpicks about the leaves on his lawn. And it also sets off this thing about cloud busting and Wilhelm Reich. And it's like, I'm sorry, I'm just sort of like, this is way too cool. I can't not talk about this. And there's this whole stuff too about like, okay, I admit, like, with Mars and Cancer, there's this thing about cutting the umbilical cord, and I've got insecurities because I'm living with my mom, and, like, whatever, my sister's living with my mom, too, and there's a lot of millennials that are forced to live with their parents due to circumstances, and, that's one of the things I struggled with, though, because I was living with a girlfriend in Nanaimo for a couple of years, and while it wasn't the perfect situation, I love having a sense of autonomy and not, feeling like an adult, having your parents weighing over you. Because I want to just be an independent adult and, and not have, well, I don't know. But the thing is, you kind of have to deal with your family, and you have to deal with people regardless. You can't ever be like that, whatever. I don't know. It's one of the things I've been struggling with anyways, and the whole Reading the Anti-Oedipus had to deal with this because it's all about these issues about how it's coded to be very shameful to live with your, to be dependent on your family. And this whole thing about individuation, that to be an individuated person, you have to be a householder. You have to have your own house. You can't just be like, there's different cultures. It's kind of funny though, because my neighbors are Indians and they have like, as far as I can tell, because I don't as friendly with all my neighbors, but as far as I can tell, when you're an Indian family, you can have a big house and you can have your grandma and your mom and your nephews and everybody just hanging out in the same house because like, I mean, it actually makes more sense objectively, I would say, especially when the housing market sucks. And like, why, like, if you have a bunch of people who are more powerful when they pool their resources together and work coordinatively, and it's also like elder care, like rather than sending your poor elders off to like, while away their last days in this lonely, they're being warehoused and treated like objects. Like, why not have incorporate them into the family structure like that we would have done in more traditional times. I mean, to me, there's all these kind of things that I don't really know if this whole really nuclear family model of society is really that helpful, right? But it's kind of like the operating system that we're structured with, right? And I don't know if I'm going to read much out of the mass psychology of fascism though, but one of the things that Wilhelm Reich talks about is things like how the Nazis played off this thing about the mother, about how they made this association where the homeland was like the motherland, and that the people that were the dirty people, that they don't like, all the people they discriminated against were seen as, these people are threats to your mother. These people, or whatever, right? They're trying to, like, you need to protect your family, you need to protect your home, you need to protect against the evil invaders, that are out to get your mother and stuff like this, right? Or that they also played off this thing about the whole thing of the virgin and the whore, and Wilhelm Reich was saying that it's kind of, the whole sex thing with women is kind of a contradiction because there's all this thing valuing women to be mothers, like the importance of the mother and all this kind of stuff. But the woman doesn't become a mother without having sex. And yet the whole thing of it's coded that for women to like sex or women to want sex is dirty and evil. And so Wilhelm Reich was actually one of the precursors to what is called the sexual revolution in the 60s. And although he was seen as, dismissed by the establishment, the counterculture really liked him. And then there's a lot of therapies like somatic therapy, different kinds of depth psychology that are very influenced by Wilhelm Reich. But this is okay. The issue, now to bring it back to all this stuff about Mercury and Jupiter conjunct in Aries, is that I feel like there's this sort of thing that goes on where Wilhelm Reich one of the things that I take a different stance with Wilhelm Reich is that Wilhelm Reich wanted to be taken seriously as a scientist. He was a contemporary of Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud, and he wanted to, Sigmund Freud wanted to make psychoanalysis like a science. And even Carl Jung, while he was more mystical, he was still, if you read Carl Jung, it's all slanted by this pressure to present his ideas in a kind of a scientific light that could be useful for modern medicine and treat, and you can't but this tension where he wanted to get into really mystical stuff, but he had to kind of make it work with science. And that in some way I think Reich was kind of facing the same problem, but Reich was the kind of guy who didn't want mysticism at all, right? And that he wanted to make everything like we can find these organic substances and we can study them scientifically, and that religion and mysticism is just like control, basically. It's like a control structure where they've told you these stories that are keeping you enslaved, and we need to break out of them and liberate our sexuality and not be repressed and all this kind of stuff. And in order to do that, we get away with all these myths and stories and just get down to the science, because the science will affirm this whole thing about the orgone but the whole funny thing is though that he was so sure that there was a stuff called orgone, but he couldn't find it anywhere. He couldn't measure it, or he tried to make all these present it in the scientific way, and it would always just fall flat. He could not make it work in that context, right? And I honestly think maybe he was going the wrong. I have an appreciation for the fact that there may be something, part of reality, which is just resistant to being turned into that. This scientific thing that you can just write in a textbook and that we can turn into a technology, and all the mystery is taken out of it, right? And that is the kind of, I think that's one of the issues with Mercury conjunct Jupiter, is that Mercury, there's the idea, Mercury stands for the micro, Jupiter stands for the macro, Mercury stands for the writer, the communicator, the thinker, and Jupiter stands for kind of this grand order that rules the universe almost, right? And when you put the two together, there may be a possibility for some insights and some valuable communication about the grand mystery and all these things that are happening, but there's a risk of taking it too concretely, trying to make it into, okay, well, we can get the theory, we can lock it down, we can build the brilliant thesis, I can be seen as a genius and everybody will respect me, and it's like, nah, if you don't get too excited, because at some point in time you have to kind of respect the limitation of what you can do with language, what you can do with words, what you can do with thinking, and all this kind of stuff. And if you take it too seriously, in that you can capture it with the language, you're gonna just turn into Wilhelm Reich, basically, and people are gonna think you're crazy. And I think that's oftentimes what happens with people who get labeled schizophrenic or something like that, is that you have to have an appreciation for the subtleties, that there's things that are real, that are more nuanced and subtle and slippery, that aren't, they don't conform to our symbol system, our language system so easily, right? And that if you try to lock it down, it may not work. One other note that I wanted to mention too is that there's a lot of talk about, Mars and Cancer and all the problems of Mars and its fall and stuff like that. But there's another character that I thought of. I mean, I have to admit that I probably mentioned Pablo Picasso a lot in my astrology videos because, what can I say? We both have Sagittarius moon placements, and I think my Sag moon, whatever. There's something about the moon of Pablo Picasso that's similar to my Sag placements, in that I have often, I have seen Pablo Picasso's art, some of his Minotaur drawings, the actual art, real art in an art gallery. So I can say that I've face-to-face seen a Picasso. And there's something about, in my art course, this is where I wanted to go with it. There's two things about Pablo Picasso. One thing, Pablo Picasso is another Mars and Cancer native, right? And Pablo Picasso, as you may know, there's this thing about the childlikeness, right? There's this whole thing about they're talking about the mismatch between Mars and Cancer. Cancer has to do with like family, the mother, the child, the sensitive things, the nursing or whatever, and Mars is like the barbarian, right? Now, Pablo Picasso, you can see his Mars in the Minotaur, right? And oftentimes these Minotaur drawings are very sexually charged, and it's kind of like the animal in man and all this kind of stuff. And he's kind of had this reputation for, I don't know, was he a bit of a womanizer or whatever? But he was also had this thing about, as he kept making art, his art became more and more childlike. And that he was kind of like trying to learn how to forget how to paint in a way. Or he's trying to come back to that basic, like to see the world as a child does, and to paint from that place of being a child. And that there was this quote where he went through all these different phases as well, where he did cubism, he had his blue phase, and not all the, he did a lot of artwork that wasn't even like this childlike style, right? He did all sorts of stuff. But there are people, when asked about these sort of different things, stages, these phases, these developments and stuff like that, he says, I don't develop, I am. Right? So this kind of thing, the whole, this idea that all these things about, making judgments about, there can be a Mars and Cancer of being like, Mars is a warrior, Mars is a barbarian, Mars needs to be like this, it needs to develop, it needs to individuate out of this situation so it can go out there and whatever, I don't know, what does a warrior do? Go kill people, right? Like, let's go, like, you need to leave the home and join the world of men so we can go and rape and pillage and kill and, no, I mean, there must be better things for men to do than that. I'm kind of being sarcastic. But this is kind of where I'm going with it, though, if you know Pablo Picasso, because one of Pablo Picasso's famous paintings is called Guernica, right? And there's another, I'm kind of going off of some ideas that I got from Adam Elenbaas here, because Adam was talking about how, especially after all the time Mars and Gemini stands for kind of a multiplicity, right? Whereas Cancer is the cardinal sign, it's about, a singular push, a singular initiation kind of thing. And I think he was sort of cautioning against this idea, like, you have to just have one stance. We're going to be like, okay, never mind all these differing points of view. We're just going to find the one right thing and then go with that. Because if you do that, that's a good way to become a fascist. Or not even like an extremist, a fundamentalist or something. You take one idea and you're like, I'm going to pick this one idea and become a fundamentalist about it. No, it's not a good idea, right? To do it like that. However, this is something I learned from the first course I took from J.F. Martel, and he was talking about, Picasso didn't like he was trying to make artwork to be like some political cartoons and stuff like that. He actually made some cartoons that went in newspapers to try to like lend his support of the cause against the fascists and stuff, but none of the cartoons he did really had quite the impact that happened with Guernica. But however, Guernica is a different story. Guernica there was a response to they bombed a town that was like completely defenseless, like out of the blue. Like there were no people like there. Yeah, it was just like having a town of civilians without much military significance. It was just an act of sheer brutalism, basically, of being, to bomb. It was like a horror, and that was and when Picasso read about it in the newspaper, he was completely shocked and made this massive painting. It takes up a big wall. And one of the things that there's also, maybe I can link if I can find, they had a good art history video that I watched all about the painting of Guernica. But one of the point that J.F. Martel was trying to make about this was that when it comes to this painting, that there's one, like, when we're talking about being political, that it's one thing to be like, I identify myself with this position, and I, believe these things, and I'll side with these people, and we will work against these people, and hopefully achieve a political. That's kind of what I'm trying to do my best to explain it. Maybe JF probably does a way better job. You can read his book Reclaiming Art. But what I'm trying to say is that there's another way to approach this, where regardless of what side you're on, regardless of what belief, what opinion you have, that you can look at an instance of something happened like Guernica and saying that it is, regardless of what your subjective beliefs are, whatever your opinions are, that this is a horrible thing. And that if you're going to there's this thing that transcends the politics, because hypothetically, maybe even somebody who was on the other side could see that this was a horrible thing, but they were so, if you were so, lost in your own position, you may say, well, it's fine for us to do these horrible things if the ends justify the means or something, right? But there's something about the sheer horror of some of the things that happen, that it's just like, it doesn't matter what you think about it. It doesn't matter what your political position is. Is that if that horror touches your heart, if you actually have a human soul that sympathizes with the suffering of these poor people that have just been brutally massacred for no good reason, just from a petty attempt to seize power, then there's something going on there that you don't need to get into politics to understand what's happening and to feel it in your soul, goddammit, right? And so there's I was also thinking about Bob Dylan. I watched half of the Bob Dylan, because they were talking about the Bob Dylan going electric. There's half of the Bob Dylan movie. I watched half the Bob Dylan movie, No Direction Home. Bob Dylan doesn't have Mars in Cancer. He's Mars in Pisces, so it's a bit of a stretch. But I think Dylan also made this. He wrote songs like The Hurricane, right? You know that one where he's standing up for the guy who was wrongfully committed for murder, and that he also did songs before that in support of the Black Civil Rights Movement. And there's a kind of this issue though where people were saying, is Bob Dylan political? Because a lot of people were saying he's not really, like, he's not really up on political theory. He's not really up on the political situation. He was more of an artist than a guy who is well versed in the politics of what's going on. And in this movie though, Bob Dylan makes a statement where he says, you know, an artist can come and support some people who are struggling and support them in their fight against their oppressors, but it doesn't have to be political. And it's kind of funny because that sounds kind of like, in today's world, that sounds kind of antithetical. Like if you were just a singer and there were a bunch of black people who were upset, they were at a Black Lives Matter rally and they were upset because one of them got killed by the police, and you went there to sing some songs with them and stuff, people would say, that guy is a total lefty, but from Bob, he's like, I'm not, like, he's just saying that's what's going on, and that's what I feel in my soul, and that I should do it, and because these people could use some support. You know, it doesn't have anything to do with politics, man. It just, what am I going to do? Just not go up there with my guitar? Like, that's kind of Bob Dylan's point. And that's also the Picasso point of view. But it's also, Picasso's a bit more complicated because he was trying to do it from a more political point of view, to be like, I'm on this side and I'll make a cartoon but when it's coming from this place that's pure, right? It's pure of the soul of like, a horrible thing is a horrible thing is a horrible thing, and it doesn't matter if you politically justify it, right? If you can politically justify, Hiroshima, it doesn't fucking matter. It's still a horror, right? If you can make your country safe and secure, it doesn't matter. You still have to deal with the reality of the horrible thing that you have done, right? And I think there's something about Mars and Cancer that, like I was saying about in my video about Mars finally leave. I don't know. Was it the Mars and Gemini? This idea that we're at this moment where people are just done with the flaming hot takes and all the bullshit, and hopefully this isn't just another flaming hot take, but there's this idea that we don't want just more jargon and theories and people being smart asses. There's this thing, when Mars is in Cancer, it cuts through the bullshit and it gets to the soul of the matter that is beyond this political stuff. It's the truth of the matter, right? And yeah, I think that's my inspiration for today's video. Hopefully you guys like this one. Yeah, there you go.